This is my first time to Iceland, so I've been very happy to have this opportunity, even though it's quite a quick visit. However, I have worked very much with some of your Nordic neighbors. I've done e-government reviews of Finland, Norway, Denmark, as well as public governance reviews of Finland and of Estonia. So I'm not saying that you're exactly alike, but I think there may be some similarities, and I'm hoping we might have some time for some discussion afterwards, and you can tell me where you see similarities with some of the observations that I've made in terms of innovation practices in other OECD countries. So as they mentioned in the introduction, I worked on e-government for about 7 years, and there we looked very much at some of innovative practices in ministries and agencies. However, I'm the first to believe that just putting services online does not equal innovation. When I began working on the public governance reviews, we began to look more at systemic features of public administrations. And in fact, that's what my presentation is going to be about today, which is sort of what do public administrations need to enable innovation to happen within the public sector. Because I think innovation happens every day. I don't think the problem is whether or not people innovate. The problem is recognizing, capturing, and duplicating effectively innovative practices. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that. So from what I understand of the prior two presentations, I think we talked a little bit about why is innovation needed and what do we mean by innovation. So I'm going to go through those quite quickly and focus more on the how to foster public innovation. And then I think also an area that many OECD countries are interested in, which is the role of citizens and of civil society in the creation of public value or delivery of public services. And so I'll focus a little bit on that as well. So what I think in terms of why innovation is needed, there's no surprises in this list, but I think it's quite interesting to talk about it in this small open economy where I am today, because before I think no one saw any political gain in talking about why we need public sector innovation, and now in this increasingly competitive global economy, the ability of the public service to deliver for less has become a critical political issue, and you just have to ask the Greeks if you doubt that question. So in terms of what do we mean by public innovation, in the last presentation they talked a little bit about the products, processes, organizations, and communications which are elements of public sector innovation. But I wanted to focus a little bit on some of the systemic innovations. What does that mean? It's not only are we innovating in how we deliver on those processes, but to what extent is that sort of circulating within the system and changing how people think? So with the notion of citizen participation or co-delivery of services, are people saying, the first thing that they think is, am I serving the citizens, or are we together trying to come up with some value added? So is there some cultural change within the public administration that changes the way people think in terms of how they deliver public services and in terms of how they learn from what others in the public administration are doing? So kind of the notion here would be leading the innovation cycle, where you start by identifying priority areas, you increase sort of the range of options of how those priorities can be delivered on, then you put in place the incentives to achieve it, and then let people go about doing it. And I think if I understood correctly in the last presentation, we talked a lot about a number of the barriers that prevent people from unleashing their creativity and being able to think outside of the box in terms of finding solutions. Then that leads to changing the culture, financing the successful practices, and then scaling up the ideas that work. And I think that oftentimes you see pilot projects all through. When I was working at OMB, I think we had a pilot project that had been in place for 30 years. That's no longer a pilot project. This is for a child care program. And so what do we learn from that? And is there the courage to shut down projects that don't work and to try something else? That's sort of what we're talking about in terms of how do you create systemic innovation. Then also that leads to how you measure innovation. And I think that the MEPIN project is quite good because it allows us to start looking across countries and compare apples and apples. What are the things that count for achieving innovation in the public sector? From the OECD perspective, we have, in terms of the data that we gather, it's maybe a little more global, because the government at a glance only looks at two basic areas. The first is innovations in policy choices. So how, in what ways do you deliver public services? And then secondly, in terms of innovations in public management practices. And now I'll get into how those fit together. In terms of innovations in policy choices, if you look at the blue area, the light blue area, that is what governments have traditionally done, which is provide services to citizens on their own. The purple area is where governments pay third parties to deliver public services on their behalf, either the private sector, outsourcing, or civil society or voluntary organizations. So that part of public service delivery has been on the increase, and yet we know very little about the effectiveness, how resources are used. So sometimes countries take it on faith that this is better. All we know is that it increases sort of the range of options of service delivery, but then afterwards you have to test that and compare it with your traditional ways of delivering services. In terms of adoption of best practice, this is just one example, which I think many OECD countries over the last 10 years have adopted the regulatory impact analysis. And so is it simply taking good practice and signing off on it and then telling all of your civil servants you must do this? I think a checkbox is not necessarily an innovation in and of itself. But when you have people thinking, when I have to go through this exercise, what is the impact? And who should I talk to in order to be really able to assess the impact of the legislation or the regulations that I'm putting into place? And then starting to think, what are the priorities for my public administration? Is it green growth or environmental concerns? Is it gender equity? And then going through that and really thinking about it and realizing that, yes, that takes time, but it can improve the policy outcomes. If you have that kind of cultural change, then perhaps you have some real innovation. If you're just doing it because every other OECD country is doing it, then I'm not so sure. So then that leads to the question, does best practice equal innovation? Some OECD best practice indicators are, or some of our process indicators are based on best practice, such as transparency in budgeting, integrity, regulatory management, and e-government. So we're trying to look at what those processes are, but we're not always sure whether they're sufficiently embedded. And so I like to use the example of the iPhone. I bought an iPhone recently, and I think that in and of itself, it's quite an innovation. But for the first 3 or 4 days, I had problems with my internet at home, and so I couldn't charge any apps onto my iPhone. And then you realize that without the apps, it's not so interesting. It's just this pretty piece of machinery. So the question is, how can we put in place those best practices or processes within the public administration so that we have a nice iPhone, but then allow our agencies to do the innovation to create the apps? And you know, when Steve Jobs first created the iPhone, he was against actually creating the App Store, because he said, we're not going to be able to control what we put onto our iPhone. And I think that's very much the logic within a lot of public administrations. Oh my goodness, if we let people innovate, we're not going to be able to control what they do. And so there, we're stopping the value creation taking place within the public sector. We have just started a project on service delivery and innovation for service delivery. So we look at the drivers, the objectives, and then those good practices or processes that are at the bottom there, those are just ways to create the nice iPhone. But in and of themselves, I don't think that they're the innovation. They're not the things that are creating value. So we need to look what is inside that circle and how can we improve that. So now we get into the how. The OECD Innovation Strategy was an OECD-wide project which mainly focused on the private sector, but also had some recommendations for the public sector. And the 5 recommendations were to develop coherent innovation frameworks, so sort of what is it that the public sector wants to achieve, designing the data systems that support that, then engaging in public-private partnerships for the delivery of services, using public information as a resource for innovation, and finally embracing e-government. So I'm just going to very quickly talk about each of those. In terms of supporting innovative capacity, when I showed you earlier that slide about how governments are providing public services, what I mentioned, there's an increased diversity of how public services are provided, using new partners, delivering it in new ways. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're better. So not only do you need to test by trying new ways, but then you also need to have accountability for the outputs and outcomes and to test and evaluate to see what is truly successful. And what I've found working with a number of OECD countries is that oftentimes the problem is not what's new, the problem is what's old, because agencies and ministries don't even know how much it costs to produce basic services. So how are they supposed to compare what their innovative process is, because they don't even know whether or not they're saving any money as one measure of innovation. In terms of bridging coordination gaps, we also try to think about the public sector as a whole, not just the central government, but also regional and subnational levels of government. Because oftentimes it's the local authorities that are the ones that are really providing the services to citizens, and yet oftentimes there's this disconnect between the policy that's created at the center and the service delivery and implementation at the local level. So we are interested in coordination gaps across government, vertically, through levels of government, and also what are those basic standards and frameworks. And then finally, there's an expression in Danish, which I can't say in Danish, but in English it's more warm hands and less cold hands, and I like that very much because it's how can we focus on the efficiency savings in the back office so that the things that the citizens don't see, we can do quicker for less money, but rather than just taking those efficiency savings and giving it to the ministries of finance, using some of it to improve service delivery and enabling frontline people to solve problems. I think that's a very nice way of thinking about how it is that we can win back the trust of citizens by putting the resources where they can see them and where it can help them the most directly. Part of this is about building a common agenda, and I don't want to belabor sort of performance management 101 because these things you all know, and I was recently in Asia and met with a lot of countries, and they were able to provide me with beautiful vision statements and very pretty charts, and the best that money can buy. Because the real question, though, is to what extent can you just go to any agency within your public administration, ask them, what is the vision for your public administration? What is your mission? And whether or not those people will know it. And I think most people would fail on that challenge. So it leads to the question, to what extent are those values truly embedded in the public administration, and to what extent they're driving the behavior of the civil servants. When I was at OMB, I was responsible for the food stamps program, which in the United States, this is 10 years, 12 years ago, was a $20 billion US program. So obviously, people were very concerned about how the money was being spent, and so all of our performance objectives for that program were about error reduction. Are you paying too much money or too little money to the recipients of the benefit? And yet at the same time, this was when President Clinton had signed the welfare reform bill, and we were very focused on getting people back to work. So I would say that the overall strategic objective, what it was that we wanted, was to get poor people back to work. And yet, what was happening in the food stamps program, whenever a low-income person started to work, suddenly their income starts to go up and down. They have a sick child, they work overtime, and then the civil servants or the social workers would say, you're working, you're giving me a higher error rate, so I'm going to start calling you in from the office to check on your hours and to see how many hours you're working. And then that makes people miss more hours of work, and then sometimes people would lose their job. And so it was completely out of sync with what it was that the government was trying to achieve overall. So then we began to say, shouldn't we be focusing on getting people back to work and using that as the ultimate indicator of success for this program, rather than whether or not you have error rates? And maybe we pay a little too much, a little too less. That will still be caught through the auditing function. But let's try to align our incentives with our strategic goals. Tied to this is also the issue of flexibility. I don't think Iceland is actually in this chart when we, there it is, yes. So it's a little bit above the OECD average in terms of the ability of ministries to transfer funds both within their administrative portfolio as well as across years. And I think that this is a very important element of fostering innovation, is allowing ministries to be their own finance ministries, to keep some of their money, some of their savings in order to reinvest it. And perhaps that's why it's less of a problem in Iceland for innovation. But this completely changes the incentive structure for ministries and agencies to try to do things better. I think a very important element of the environment for innovation is also the governance of public sector agencies. Now, I know that in all of the Nordic countries, there's a very long tradition of using agencies for service delivery. When we did the public governance review of Ireland, we found that many of the agencies were created whenever there was a problem. The ministers would say, okay, what is the way that I can respond quickly and visibly to this problem? Oh, I create an agency. And then I take the people who are complaining the most and I put them on the board for the agency. And then that way they'll be happy and they won't complain anymore. And so in fact, what they had was a total agency, we called it an agency zoo, because the governance structure and the regulations governing those agencies had nothing to do with their actual purpose. And so the advice that we gave to them is, for those agencies that provide very straightforward, predictable outputs, then they should be given additional administrative flexibility in terms of their HR, in terms of their budget, so that they can experiment and come up with new ways of delivering it. But that those agencies should have very little flexibility in terms of determining what their objectives should be. They shouldn't have boards. They should be very narrowly defined, because otherwise they would always be scope creep. On the other hand, for those agencies that need greater independence, whether it's because they have regulatory functions or perhaps they're research agencies, that those then perhaps should have more standard, that the more standard administrative guidelines should apply to them, but then they would be able to perhaps have greater independence in terms of their policy scope. So it's really about matching what the function is with the structure. And I think that this applies very much to the size and context of a country. And at the OECD, I know that it's very easy to just sort of give one-size-fits-all solutions. When we did the public governance review of Estonia, there was an academic, Sarapuu, who wrote an article on what are the characteristics of small states. And I liked it very much because I think it helps one to think about what is appropriate for the size of the country. So what she identified in small states is that due to the scale, there's a limited scope for goals and activities of the public administration, so you have to prioritize. You can't do everything. Secondly, that everyone has to be a jack of all trades. There's this multifunctionalism of civil servants and organizations because there just aren't enough people to specialize. Thirdly, there's an informality of structures and procedures, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, I think that's often the strength of small countries. People know each other, they make a phone call, things get done. And that's something that is an advantage over more formal, more rigid structures. Fourthly, there are constraints on steering and control. This had to do with some of the internal relationships between political and administrative elites that sometimes would limit the freedom of people to act because, once again, everyone knows each other, and so sometimes they don't have as much independence as they need. And that leads to the last issue, which was the personalization of roles and functions, so that oftentimes an individual would bring his or her charisma into the position. We often call that leadership, but it becomes completely dependent on an individual to get things done, the success or failure of a project. So I think if you take into account some of these characteristics of small states, then it helps you to start thinking about what types of regulatory frameworks are needed, how much flexibility should I give, and also, should the accountability be political, should it be administrative, or should it be social in terms of achieving the goals for the public administration? In terms of the data, that was the second element of the how to achieve public administration. The OECD has, in our Government at a Glance publication, we look at indicators across all of what the public administration does to try to capture, once again, this policy environment for public administration. But that's still a very high level, very global kind of a view. When I read through the MEPIN report, one thing that I really liked was not only does it look at individual practices for innovation, but it also looks at what that context that drives innovation is in terms of the information channels, the innovation drivers, and the level of cooperation, procurement, the actors. So this gets back perhaps a little bit to what I was talking about small states. What are the characteristics that are appropriate for Nordic countries? Another example that I like very much is the Canadian Common Measurement Tool, which is basically a database. It's a set of questions that can be used across agencies, but it's standardized. So agencies can take these questions, they can use them to look at the level of satisfaction with the services that they provide. But then in return, and they get technical assistance. There's a nonprofit agency in the Canadian government that sort of diffuses this. It's a little bit like the CAF in Europe. But in return, then they provide that data back to the agency, it collects it, and it starts doing some analysis. What are the functions? What processes have led to greater user satisfaction? So this, I think, is part of this element of a learning organization across the whole of government, so that organizations can learn from each other in a standardized way. And then the third or fourth element, I'm losing track of my list, is that of public-private partnerships. And I think that we define public-private partnerships as an agreement between government and one or more private partners, according to which private partners deliver the service. So, especially in the current fiscal environment, a lot of governments are turning to public-private partnerships as a solution to kind of their fiscal crunch in order to fund infrastructure and a lot of other projects. But I think that oftentimes PPPs are also a way of leveraging know-how and expertise as well as funding. And then even more importantly, or perhaps the issue that people think the least about, is to what extent it's forcing the public administration to define what it is that it wants to achieve through these partnerships. Because if you do it yourself and something happens along the way, or then you can kind of, move some staff or put some more resources in. But if you have a private partner and you say, oh, I'd like to make a little change, they say, okay, well, that's 20 million euros. So it forces you to start thinking from day one, what is it that I really want to achieve? What are the risks to my project? And what steps will I put in place if there are unforeseen circumstances? And I think that this type of discipline is something that we should do in all of our planning for public administration projects, and not just for PPPs. But PPPs bring it to the forefront because it forces administrations to really think about what is it that we want to achieve and how can we achieve it. So, just a couple of examples of e-government projects that I think are very interesting in terms of leveraging projects for service delivery. The Italian Post uses its post offices to deliver a wide range of public services, not just the traditional postal services. And in Spain, they have now provided public sector data to the private sector in order to try to promote the use of new value creation or new public services from the private sector. And the US, as part of Obama's Open Government Initiative, is also trying to do this, and it's happening at all levels of government. I think that the city of San Francisco recently made available lots of information to the public sector and then encouraged small startups to create apps for the iPhone, for others, to try to make use of that information. And so here, now we're starting to look at the interface, not just of innovation within the public sector, but also how do you use innovative ways of working to promote value creation in the private sector and also to leverage growth. When we look at e-government, we find that e-participation and the provision of e-services tend to track one another. Now, Iceland is down in that bottom corner quadrant of the chart, and I don't know enough about e-government in Iceland to be able to explain that. And I would be very interested to know whether this is sort of consistent with what citizen desires are, what they want, or whether there's greater demand for higher levels of service delivery and greater e-participation or channels of participation electronically. But you'll see that most of the other Nordic countries tend to be up more in the right-hand top quadrant. The OECD just published a report on M-government. So now we've gone from e-government to M-government, which is mobile government, putting the services onto your mobile phones. And now the new trendy term is U-government, or ubiquitous government. But I think that there is really a transformation there because it does mean much greater openness of data and much greater permeability between the public sector and the private sector for value creation, much like the Spanish or the US examples that I was just talking about. The US has taken it even one step further in terms of crowdsourcing. There is this challenge.gov website which allows people to propose solutions to the government, and they provide cash awards. So this is not, you're not just depending on people's generosity, but actually creating a profit motive for coming up with solutions. And individual civil servants can actually say, here is a problem that I haven't been able to solve in my administration. And they can propose that to this website, and there's a procedure to approve it. And obviously, it has to go through the hierarchy of the agency. But it can go onto the website, and then they look for solutions to come from everywhere. And you'll see that just last year, over 1,500 solutions were submitted, and on average, $300,000 US in prizes for those solutions. France has also done something similar, but for administrative simplification. And in a year and a half, it had 700 proposals. So this is also a way of engaging the citizens, getting them involved in the problems that the public sector faces. So I'm going to conclude with the OECD project on co-production, which we define as a way of planning, designing, and delivering public services which draws directly on input from citizens, service users, and civil society organizations. So this leads to a series of questions. Are services independent, or are they prompted by the public service agencies? Is it working with or instead of the professionals that traditionally have provided the services? Is it occasional, or will it eventually be mainstreamed into service delivery? And then finally, is it short or long-term partnership? And what we find is that when we sent a questionnaire out on co-production in OECD countries, and in fact, people meant a lot of different things by that term. But what we do know that it's not about simple citizen involvement, it's a much deeper relationship than that, and that it is also not about contractual arrangements. This is about involving citizens and appealing to something greater than simply a financial arrangement. So when we asked countries what were their incentives for co-production, the demand we found actually came from the public administration more than from civil society or citizens themselves. And we also found that the reasons for using co-production were ultimately to increase involvement of users and to improve services, and that actually the reason that was cited the least was to save money. We also find that co-production, the barriers to it, the ones that were most often cited were lack of resources and the lack of knowledge and skills needed to put those practices into place. And then the third most important reason for the lack of co-production services was the lack of evidence of the potential benefits of co-production. So in fact, there was a huge demand from agencies to help create the business case for co-production, to help them have some evidence of why this can create value for them. I'm going to skip through some of these examples. I think if the presentation is available, then people can look at it when they have time. But the ultimate goal is shifting control to the users, empowering them, and therefore giving them greater confidence in the public sector. So the OECD has launched a study on co-production. This talks about some of the tools, thank you, and how it can be achieved. And then our methodology is that we have done a survey of the 26 of the 34 OECD countries, and we've collected 58 country examples, and we're looking at all areas of service delivery across the public sector. And the next steps will be deepening data collection. We will be launching an observatory of innovative public sector practices, which will have a website that people can consult. I'm hoping that there will be a lot of Icelandic examples, and I hear this afternoon we'll be talking about some of those. And looking at what are some of those key elements of co-production that lead to success, and therefore to help countries make that case for co-production. So just to sum up, I think that there's a lot of different elements of that we could call innovation. The front line, or the cutting edge now, seems to be that interface with citizens and how we can test it or use it in different ways in order to have more of a partnership for the creation of service public value. Once again, there's not really yet the business case, so there's nothing proved. But by testing and having a greater diversity of different models and then trying to evaluate and get some evidence on those, I think that's the way that we can learn from one another, both within our countries and across our countries. So thank you very much.